Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 27th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And before I dive into this week's episode, before I thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible, I want to apologize for not having a new show up last week. The horrific fires here in Los Angeles really affected everyone in different and I guess just intense ways. And so during that time when they were ongoing and everything was very touch and go, and there were, problems with even just maintaining our electricity or our internet service, I just thought it best to kind of take a pause and not push too hard. So I wasn't able to get a new episode up last week, but I am very excited about this week's episode. And I'm also very grateful for all of you who reached out via social media and through other channels to express your concern and who have Angelinos in your minds and your hearts right now. So thank you for that. This week's top patrons, I was about to dive right in. We will get to the new episode in just a second, but remember that Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way I keep this thing going, really the only way that I pay for this show, is through my Patreon account. So if you're interested in supporting the show right now, it's on an episodic basis. I think they're going to change that model, which means it's probably going to mean a big hit to how we pay for the show. But as of right now, we're pledging on an episodic basis, not a monthly basis. All you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. And a little note, it's preferable if you use the website if you don't use the Apple app, because Apple is taking a massive cut from all of the patrons through the app. And so if you just, if you're on an iPhone and you still want to use Patreon, don't use the app. Just go to the website and more of that money will go to the creators. So yeah, quick tip for any of you who are going about it that way. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so, so much. All right, so I'm literally just finished the recording, so it's fresh in my mind. I had the privilege of having a wonderful chat with Dr. Eleanor Barraclough. She is a historian, a writer, and a broadcaster based at Bath Spa University. She studied at the University of Cambridge, and she held positions at both Oxford and Durham previously. She's written one previous book and numerous articles for different outlets that you have read. She now kind of spends most of her time presenting radio programs, podcasting. She still does some TV, but she does have a new book out, and it is fascinating. It's called Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Eleanor Barraclough. Eleanor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Such a huge pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. And I have to admit, right out of the gate, everything about the Viking Age is a hidden mystery to me, because this is just an area that I have never spent much time. I don't know why. I've never been arrested by the film or the television or that story. And I have friends who are obsessive over this area of history. It sounds like probably you are a bit excited about this time in history, but I don't know why it's never grabbed me. I'm thinking maybe it's because it's always been presented in a very over-the-top kind of way.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly it. And that was always for me what I wanted to get away from, almost a sort of cartoon version of the
Mm.
Viking Age. And also, let's not kid ourselves, a really male version of the Viking Age,
Very much
because
so. Yeah, it always just felt like the action movie testosterone forward. And I was like, that's not for me. I don't know. It never felt like it was for me.
yeah, no, I agree. And for me, I came to it from a very different point of view. So I was someone who was always really interested. Well, I still am very interested in a lot of different historical time periods, but also storytelling and traveling and like really wild and sort of exciting parts of the world where stories are told about humans in different ways because they've had to live in different ways in these places. And so I came to it first as someone who had got to explore, but not enough, the like extraordinary landscapes of the far north of, Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, the Arctic, those sorts of places where a lot of, but not all of the Viking Age stories played out, but also through the literature, through the language. That's how it started for me. And that was really it, that when I was learning the language, for me, there was such poetry in it. And so I came to it as someone who was looking for the voices, always looking for the voices and the stories and the mythology, the history of these people as told by themselves in their own ways. And that for me was far more interesting than, yeah, as you say, these kind of like big testosterone headline hitters, kind of, was it like blokes with beards and boats, basically. That never really
Yeah,
did
and
it for me either.
horns on their heads,
Right,
just
which
like,
they
yeah,
didn't even
looking
have.
angry.
Yeah, this is see, it's terrible. Every time I do my signature, so if I'm sort of book signing, my signature is so appalling that I've been told that it looks like a slug has tried to crawl across the page and then has sort of died halfway. So I tend to add a little cartoon of a Viking, and there's no real other way of making it obvious it's a Viking if you don't put horned helmets on it. But I've got told off. I mean, like, people have brought their children up and said, "I've just seen your signature. You know they didn't have horned helmets." So, which I have to say is slightly better. I did a book signing a couple of weeks ago. Someone came back to me after I'd signed it. He said, "Sorry, could you sign the book?" I said, "I did." And he said, "Oh gosh, that's your signature." And then he just keep practicing and then high-fived me and walked up. It was, oh, that was a low moment.
Oh, that's
So,
amazing.
yeah, to be fair, it is a really bad signature, but now it's a really bad and historically inaccurate signature to
Inaccurate.
boot.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But that is so funny. Maybe a good place to kind of dive in right at the top is, and I know it sounds like really, but maybe you could help us understand two things that are probably very important. Is number one, what is a Viking? Like, how do we even define that term? And number two, when was this era? Help us
Oh,
orient to this
yeah.
time period.
This is really important. And I feel that people tend to sort of like talk about Vikings without covering the basics, those
Mm-hmm.
basics. And it's in the same way, if I don't know, if I were sort of asking about even sort of really popular big ones like ancient Egypt, I actually find it really difficult to sort of orient myself in
Mm-hmm.
time periods and chronologies.
Yeah.
So yeah, when it comes to the Vikings, well, the meaning of the word Viking actually also is very much related to the chronology. So that's kind of useful. So
Oh, okay.
Viking is actually an Old Norse word to start with. It's Vikingur, and it literally just means a raider. So Old Norse being the language that the Vikings spoke, sort of medieval Scandinavians as well. So it means a raider or a pirate. And they've got another version of that word, which is essentially the verb. So sort of you go a Viking, you go on a raid, and it tends to be over the summer. So no one's a Viking all the time to start with anyway. It's an activity, it's sort of a seasonal occupation at best. There's also an Old English version of the word. So Old English being sort of contemporary with the Viking Age, but we're talking about, the people who sometimes are referred to as Anglo-Saxons who sort of lived in England during this period. And their version of the word also means pirate, and it's weeching. So, there are some arguments about where that word actually comes from and, who had it first and all the rest of it. But that means that when we sort of take it out a little bit and we think about, okay, when was the Viking Age? Well, the most obvious and sort of straightforward way to sort of define the chronology is to say, all right, well then when was the first raid? That can be the start of the Viking Age. And there's a very famous raid on the island of Lindisfarne, which is off the northeast coast of England. It's very close to where I used to live up there. And basically, there was this very, very wealthy, completely undefended monastery. And in the year 793 AD, it's attacked by Vikings. And this obviously sort of sends shockwaves through England, through medieval Europe. People are writing about it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which sort of is written down later, says, never before, here in this year came dreadful portents over the land of the Northumbrians, and the people were terrified, and there were sheets of lightning and fiery dragons were seen, and then the Northmen attacked. So there's that real sense of shock. But on the other hand, you know what it's like. It's really difficult to say, okay, in this year, on this day, this era began. And of course, when we, so when you look into it, when you kind of dig down, that's also true of the Viking Age. So, because you have to think, okay, well, that's one raid that we know about. And there are texts that sort of indicate there's kind of some violence visited upon the people of England, or at least a person of England who's sort of killed trying to make 3 shiploads of sort of Danes, they call them, but sort of Scandinavians more generally, go and visit the king. And that's down on the south coast. And that's a couple of years before that. But then you have to think, well, okay, the raids aren't the first thing that happens. Something goes before the raids. And for example, about 10 years ago, archaeologists discovered in Estonia. So we have to think, okay, Scandinavia being the heartlands of the Viking Age, we think about going west, sort of the British Isles, for example, but we go east, and archaeologists discovered this island of Saaremaa in Estonia, sort of essentially a Nordic ship and a Nordic boat from Sweden, from close to what's now Stockholm, dating from around 750. So that's nearly 50 years before that raid. And it's got dozens and dozens of people who've been killed violently, who've been buried in it, who are sort of from Sweden as we think of it now. And it looks like they were maybe going east to sort of open up diplomatic links, sort of establish trade routes, which is all very much part of the Viking Age too. So do you know what I mean? It's tricky, but we can say sort of 8th century, we can say second half of the 8th century perhaps, but who knows what other evidence is still there waiting to be discovered. And then of course we've got the same problem at the other end, right? We've got, well, when does it end? And one date that's often used is 1066, because that's when sort of everything kicks off in England, and King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, is sort of, he goes up to York and he kills Harald Hardrada, who's the king of Norway at that time, and who's sort of mounting an invasion and trying to stake his claim to the throne. But then of course we know that Harold Godwinson himself gets killed by William the Conqueror, who's come over, the Normans, and so that whole historical period sort of tips over into something else. But again, a bit like Lindisfarne, that's a really, I don't know, sort of Anglo-centric way of thinking about history, because there's everything else is still going on.
Those were the texts. Those were the texts that people originally, not people, but those who were writing the texts were reading those texts. And that's what we learned in school. And I think that's how the history perpetuates, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And there are other texts and other sorts of evidence, archaeological evidence and so on, from other parts of this very wide sort of, it's sometimes called now the Norse diaspora, this kind of very broad cultural sphere that ends up, they're settling in Greenland for nearly 500 years. They're up, in the far north in the Arctic. They end up sort of establishing whole civilizations down the sort of waterways, the steppes of Eurasia in what's now Ukraine, Russia, and so on. So, and then of course they're in Byzantium, which is now Istanbul in Turkey, but then was this sort of glittering empire. And they even end up in Baghdad in what's then the Islamic Caliphate. So all those different places have different timelines. Do you know what I mean? So they're connected, but And even if, I mean, we say Anglo-centric, even if we just go north over the border to what's now Scotland, we have the Battle of Largs, and that's sort of almost exactly 200 years after the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when Harold Hardrada is killed. The Battle of Largs, it's still the Scottish king and the Norwegian king fighting it out for territory in the Hebrides. And then you go to the Northern Isles, and so sort of still talking British Isles, but that's now Orkney and Shetland, so off that northern coast of Scotland. Well, they belonged to Norway until sort of 1468 or something, where they're sort of handed over to the Scottish king as part of a dowry. So do you know what I mean? It's so much more complicated, which is also so much more interesting.
It is good. I think we think of, quote, people, like a people, as either a geographic group or an ethnic group or both. And I think that's why the sort of Viking history is complicated to a layperson, because we're like, okay, well, but who were they? Where were they from? And then we're like, are they a whole people, or were they an occupation within a people?
Yes. Yeah, and that's why that word diaspora is actually quite useful, because if we think of the Scandinavian homelands as essentially being where it all kicks off, that's fine. So we've got Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. But it's this idea that a sense of a diaspora, in that there is still, as these people spread out and sort of discover new lands, colonize new lands, but not necessarily in the way that we might think of colonization. Although sometimes, yes, they settle in lands that are empty. They embed themselves within other cultural groups, and in time become something much more resembling those cultures. And that's particularly the case when they're sort of interacting in the East with Slavic cultures. But for a lot of it, for example, you look at Iceland and Greenland, they're still talking this language, that we started with, Old Norse, and they're still looking back to their homelands. Essentially, they're still connected to Norway in particular, Denmark, Sweden when they're facing east. So it's not that the whole thing is this horrible mess where you just can't sort of get a handle on any sort of truth, or it's like, well, okay, are these people even related after a point? At the point where Norse Greenland comes to an end, and we're talking first half possibly of the 15th century almost. So we think of that timeline going from kind of late 8th century all the way up to sort of the 15th century, and they're still talking, it seems, a form of Old Norse, and they're still very much looking back to these homelands, and no one's quite sure what happened in terms of, okay, why did this come to an end? There are all sorts of factors, not least things like climate change. It gets a lot colder, there's a lot more ice, the routes, the sailing routes become a lot more dangerous. But that's part of the reason for the collapse, is that they need those connections because they're still very much part of that sphere.
So when I think about, and forgive my ignorance, but places like, and it's so funny because I'm actually going on a vacation tomorrow to Iceland. So
nice.
hopefully I'll
I'm
learn
so
more about this. Yeah, I'm very excited.
I'll give you tips.
Oh, great. Yeah. But when I think about Iceland, and especially Greenland, but definitely Iceland as well, they don't have, or maybe I'm wrong here, they didn't have an indigenous population. These were places where people were not, right?
Yeah. So certainly in the case of Iceland, yes. So there's a sort of little hint, and I think it's quite plausible, that there were people who were there when the first Icelanders turn up. So Iceland is kind of traditionally said to be settled from around 871 plus or minus a couple of years. And the wonderful thing is there that the texts from medieval Iceland, written a few centuries later, tell us this. But also, essentially a volcano goes off in Iceland at just really just before the first settlers arrive. And so we can date that volcanic layer, we can date the tephra, and you can see around most of Iceland that is settled, sort of, so around the coastline, those first settlements are almost directly on top of that tephra layer, which is a wonderful thing, where sort of different types of evidence come together. But the texts that tell us about the settlement also say a group that they call the Papar, like Papar, were there, but they didn't want to live amongst the pagan Norse who've sort of come over from Norway and also the British Isles, particularly the women. And so they leave, and they leave behind sort of bells and croziers and books. And so the idea there is that they are Christians. They're sort of part of this sort of peregrinatio tradition where holy men, particularly from sort of Ireland and that Celtic fringe, they set out to find places of solitude,
Right.
essentially
So they're
setting
not
themselves.
indigenous.
No,
Yeah, these are, I mean, they're
exactly.
Christian. They're pretty modern at this
Yeah,
point. Yeah.
exactly. And the
Yeah.
thing is, I mean, this would have, if they were there, this would have been an absolutely tiny group, and it's not like they can sort of, how do I put it nicely, sort of replicate themselves, and so it's not sort of a social community in the way that you would think about an indigenous population. Absolutely not. The case with Greenland is slightly more complicated because certainly there are plenty of groups historically who did occupy different parts of Greenland. But at the period when the Norse arrived, so we've got to think sort of the Norse end up settling the lower part of the west coast of Greenland, essentially up to modern day Nuuk, the capital. There's a lot more of Greenland beyond that, and obviously we know there's a lot of the interior that is covered in ice, and so it really isn't inhabitable. Certainly not for a sort of medieval European farming and hunting population. But at the point where the Norse arrive, and if Iceland is settled from around 871, then the Norse arrive in Greenland around the year 985 or so. And we can talk about that because that's like the story of Eric the Red, and from Greenland it's almost like a jumping off point where they end up exploring part of the coastline of North America. So I mean, it's the most incredible story. But so that's quite a lot later. And although there are no indigenous people, they've kind of, they've stopped living in that part centuries earlier. But what we then find is that there are other indigenous groups that cross, who are sort of the ancestors of today's sort of Inuit Greenlanders.
Mm-hmm.
And they cross from Canada and they come down that west coast. And we
Oh,
know
okay.
that, so it's a tricky one. It's not
Right,
that,
because that one is connected to this larger population in
yes.
North America. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
we know that there are interactions. There are Norse texts that describe just sort of little hints of those interactions. We also have kind of very small bits of evidence. The indigenous populations coming from the north to the south have occasionally sort of carved faces that look very much like that long-nosed European type, sort of the Norse face as it would have been then. And it's been suggested that that's an artistic representation of these encounters. It's not like, for example, when they tip up in England and they want to settle, which is sort of after this raiding period, well, there's people there already. So there's a jostling, should we say, although again, it's not quite clear the nature of that jostling. That's something that archaeologists are continuing to sort of uncover the story of. But yes, in the case of the far west, from a Norse perspective, it is a different story.
It's fascinating to think that there were just no people on Iceland. I don't know why that's a hard thing for me to believe, but I guess it's true. Nobody bothered to go there.
Yeah, well, and also it's just, I mean, for me, it's always the sheer sort of practicality of, okay, so you've got a boat, and you know what it's, I mean, even if you're, I'm assuming, flying there tomorrow, and you'll just see, there's so much sea, there's so much water, and you know what the North Atlantic's like. It's not the most forgiving, calm body of water. So I also find it extraordinary if this group they call the Papar, these sort of Christian hermits essentially did end up there, they'd have been traveling in these tiny little coracles. That's terrifying. I hate to think how many of them didn't make it. It's but then
True.
with the
Yeah.
Norse ships as well. So there's a really interesting description of the first ships that set out from Iceland to get to Greenland when they decide they're going to settle there. And it says of, I don't know, maybe 24 ships or something, around half of them don't make it. They're either driven back to Iceland or they're shipwrecked,
Oh,
lost.
geez.
I think it's almost more extraordinary that people do make it out to Iceland.
That they did make, yeah, that's true. It's funny because I often think about these like very, very ancient, indigenous populations spreading around to all of these Pacific islands. But it's a different sea. That's true. But it was so early that these people decided to, fling themselves around the globe and find new lands. And so it's always interesting when I hear, really? This was like, 7, 8, 900 years after the Common Era. That's late.
That's it. That's it. So Iceland is one of the last major land masses sort of that to be settled when the Norse arrived. But I think it's also true. Is it true for New Zealand that's even later? There's certainly, bigger land masses that are settled even later. And a lot of it is just sheer, practicality. And yeah, I find I'm talking from I work in this tiny little potting shed, down in London, and I have next to me this really cute little sort of wooden Viking ship that I stole out of my children's bedroom because it's far too nice to be a toy. And it's got these little people in it, and it's all very sort of cute. But quite often when I'm in here and I'm writing, researching, I look at it and I just think, oh my goodness, what this represents, this cute little ship, in terms of what people are actually doing.
Oh,
at this
absolutely.
time. It's extraordinary. I would not be brave enough. I get horribly seasick. I'm sort of such a bad Viking historian. I'm vegan and I get seasick. It's really embarrassing. I wouldn't last 2 minutes.
I was just recently, and I was looking it up while we were talking. I was just recently in Stockholm and I visited the Vasa, which is much later, right? This is like 1626. But this was a warship, a Swedish warship, and it's like perfectly preserved. That's why it's so incredible because of the way it sunk in the chemistry of the water and it was perfectly preserved, which is incredible. But I felt all those same feelings you're talking about looking at this ship, which is not even that old. And I was like, no, thank you.
Yes.
I would never want to live on this thing.
No, exactly. I think 5 minutes in the Viking Age and I'd have probably been sort of outlawed for just pure incompetence. It's not. But then again, it was thanks to outlawry that Eric the Red sort of ended up discovering Greenland and then founding this settlement. He starts off in Norway, and this is kind of second half of the 10th century. He starts off in Norway, he gets outlawed for killings, as they put it nicely, and then he moves to Iceland and he starts another feud there. Of course he does, very Viking, and then he gets outlawed from there, but only for 3 years. And then he obviously thinks, oh goodness, well, I've exhausted all my options back east, I may as well head west. And so he ends up exploring the fjords of the west coast of Greenland for 3 years, and then it's him that comes back and gathers up his friends and his followers and says, all right, out we go, let's see what we can. And again, I think that's an incredible, it's like Greenland is not as everyone always says, and it is said in the sagas, oh, Eric basically called it Greenland to encourage people to settle there, is what the sagas tell us. But I've done quite a lot of research out there, and in the summer, the bits they settled, beautiful, sort of green and rolling hills and absolutely gorgeous. The problem just comes that the winters are so long and hard and so again
I've decided to visit Iceland in the middle of January.
No, but you might get the Northern Lights.
That's why I'm going. That's a thing. It's not the only reason I'm going, but yes,
it's
long,
a good reason.
Dark nights is
no, I love
weather.
that time of year. I remember I was working up in Svalbard once, and it was January, and I think that was my point. I know plenty of people live there and love it, but I loved it while I was there. But I remember being on the plane on the way back and seeing the sun essentially sort of rise because we were traveling south. I've never been so grateful to see the sun. I was like, okay, that's my limit apparently.
Exactly. It's brutal. And it's funny because, we speak about brutality. We opened this conversation talking about the stereotypes of the Viking Age and the Viking people. And in a way, we can see why that stereotyping exists. It's based in the language. This was a pirate people. We're talking about conquest and murder and all of these things. But the Vikings weren't just dudes, right? They would have died out pretty quickly. So, so it makes me wonder, what what were the people who weren't doing the plundering, and the
Yes.
killing? Were they also Vikings? And where were they? What were they
Yeah.
up to?
So yeah, this is it, and this is so much of what I wanted to sort of explore in the book Emperors of the Hands, because exactly that. It's, oh come on, you weren't all doing that. Your society would have collapsed. And like I said, even the people who were on these raids, well, most of the year, most of them were farmers. You can't just survive going around raiding. In fact, in the sagas, the stories that are written down in Iceland about the Viking Age, sort of, from the 13th century, but they have very long oral roots. They're not hugely complimentary about people who carry on doing Viking raids when really they should have grown up a bit and settled down. It's always a little bit embarrassing. It's like someone's sort of slightly aged uncle who's still going out partying when everyone else is like, oh,
Yeah.
really? So that's the first thing to note. The second thing though is that there's one really, I really enjoy the fact, if we're just thinking about, well, okay, so the tricky thing is when we're talking about, well, what was everyone else up to? Of course, it sort of comes back to what we were talking about in the beginning. This is a huge chronological period of sort of several centuries, but it's also a really diverse, sort of, I say, a diverse cultural group. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. But, it's really quite spread out. And so what this culture represents for someone, for example, living in sort of Kyiv during the period where it's very much sort of Scandinavian run and founded, is going to be, and that's maybe 900s or something, is going to be really different if you're, for example, a hunter up in Arctic Greenland trying to get walrus so you can sort of harvest the ivory and the skins and sell it and make enough money and bring enough things in to keep your farmstead going. So that's one thing. But then, of course, it's also true that, yeah, exactly as you say, there's a load of course, there are men, but even if we're just talking about the men, there are men at the top of the pile and the bottom of the pile, and there are old men and young men and sort of enslaved men and all sorts of things that we have to think about there. And then, well, the same is just as true of the women, except in a way, even if you're a woman at the top, well, you're most of the time not going to be as top as the men who are the equivalent of you. And so, there's lots of different layers to break down. And part of so sort of in the book, I actually really struggled. I knew what I wanted to write about. And I knew the sort of evidence I wanted to look for, which was essentially, I call it sort of the little bits and pieces, the ephemera of life that sort of slip between the cracks in the floorboards of history, and survive down to the
Oh,
present day.
so like
Things,
like real
yeah,
archaeological evidence.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Physical
really,
objects.
exactly, and very, very intimate ones, but also kind of often very everyday ones. So children's drawings or the spindle wools, the weights that would be used in textile production that often had the names of the women who owned them sort of carved in runes at the bottom, or kind of gaming pieces, things like that. Things that give us a sense of that rounded picture. That was what I was interested in. But what I really struggled with, and sort of the irony here, is that when I wrote my first book, which was about, it's called Beyond the Northlands, it's about the sort of far travelers of the Viking world and the stories that they brought back and turned into sagas. So the irony there is that the easiest thing about that was the structure, because I decided I'll do basically north, south, east, and west. Let's keep it simple. But when you're trying to sort of, I suppose you might say, sort of reach out in time and try and find the ordinary everyday humans of the past, but in a way that isn't sort of, you're not telling their stories in an ordinary way, because I mean, certainly I would get quite bored of that quite quickly. It's like, okay, why were you extraordinary in yourselves? It was really tricky to structure, and I ended up doing it thematically. And so, there's chapters on love and religious belief and play and what home means and sort of what it means to be free or not free, or the sort of things that we can still relate to today. But
Absolutely.
do you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah, they're
when,
people. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But there is a trap there in there, and
Mm,
this is this really tricky historical trap, which is exactly as you say, they're people. And so you start to look at these objects and you think, oh, I've got the equivalent of that. Yeah,
right,
I get you.
right.
I see you, And of course,
Uh-huh.
what's that cliche, the past is a different country, and it's a different universe a lot of the time. And again, that goes back to what you were saying at the beginning. It is, relatively speaking, it's a brutal age. It's a short-lived age. It's an age where there are very different codes of conduct and different ways of being in the world. And so there's always that great unknowability. For me, I love that. I love trying to write from the point of uncertainty. Because do you know, I don't know if you've probably had conversations like this on the podcast before, but
I have, because instead
yeah,
of, not so much from, I mean, yes, sometimes from a writing perspective, but I guess my side of it is, as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, so much of what I work with my patients on is being in the gray, being in the unknown, and sitting. I work in a cancer center, right? It's all about uncertainty. And how do we find comfort in the not knowing? How do we exist in that space?
exactly that. And I mean, I remember when I was at university, I basically chose as I think I put it at the time, the weirdest degree. I'm going to find the weirdest degree to do, and it's called, like, it really was. It was beautiful. And luckily, I'm weird too, so I stayed until I'd finished my PhD as well. I was like, "Yep, I found my weird home." But it's called Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic, and so it covers sort of what we traditionally think of sort of the Dark Ages, and it's the literature, the languages, the history, the sort of anthropology, and all these things of sort of a set of cultures in and around the first millennium CE, essentially around kind of Western Europe, but also very much expanded because no cultural area is an island. But I remember at the time finding it really difficult because I'd sit in lectures and I'd think, oh, these people, and not just the lecturers, but also the other students, I think they know, there's an answer and I'm just missing the answer, and I don't know why it doesn't feel straightforward to me. And I struggled with history more than I struggled with languages and literature, because languages and literature, it's sort of, particularly with literature, it's sort of built into it that it's going to be subjective. But with history, I always felt, well, history is dates and it's people and
Right.
it's
Yeah.
reasons things happen. And, if I don't quite
And we
understand
know
the
them
reason,
all. Yeah. It's
right,
all there.
exactly, exactly. Yeah. And it took me years to understand. It's like, oh, no, it's okay. It's okay. The gray areas are where it's sort of, yeah, exactly as with your stuff. It's where the humanity happens,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I found some of these books, some of the chapters or some of the themes within them quite, when I say difficult to write, I mean, I'm someone who has always written for a living and who's always found it difficult. So that's a whole other, I really envy people who sit down, they just like, oh yeah, I just knocked out another chapter.
I always think they're lying. Like, I'm
Wow.
with you. I
Yeah.
don't write for a living because I don't enjoy writing.
It's so
I have
hard, isn't
written,
it?
but it's so hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so hard.
Well, see, no, unfortunately, I'm married to someone who he also writes as part, and he does it for fun. He does it in the
Oh
evening.
God,
I'm in bed.
whatever.
I know, and the really annoying thing
Infuriating.
is, yeah, I mean, I would hate him if he wasn't so delightful as a human, but but he also, yeah, I'll go to bed and I'll be sort of watching whatever sort of brain rotting TV program I'm trying to sort of turn my brain off with, absolute dross. And he's sort of in the other room, in the sitting room, just making these beautiful worlds in his mind. And he's just like, oh, it's just really nice. Whereas for me, it's always a struggle. But then there was this other struggle that sort of went into this, which was, and it comes back to the grey areas, that often when you're looking for the ordinary humans, the stories are not always nice. And by definition, if you're writing about history, you're writing about sort of, not to sort of get too morbid, but you're writing about death a lot of the time. And I find that really hard. I find writing up, trying to find the individuals of history and writing about that sense of kind of mortality and loss. And when you're looking for emotion, that was why I have chapter 3 on love in sort of all sorts of ways that can sort of be interpreted. And I end with these pictures by this small child who's sort of living in Novgorod, but after sort of when it's no longer a Viking place, it's no longer really Scandinavian, sort of in terms of its cultural inflection. It's very much Slavic. But I really struggled writing that because it's so immediate. Looking at these pictures done by this small child in a sort of essentially in a classroom, and do you know what I mean? It's a hard thing to look at, and
I
yeah,
do, but I also, it's funny because I work in a cancer center, because I work in end of life and specialize in that area, I read and focus on mortality and death a lot, and I confront it a lot. And I do find that for most human beings, there is an avoidance and an intensity there. But I guess it's like exposure therapy. The more you do it,
yeah,
yeah,
that's
the
yeah.
like, not that it gets easier, but I think you find the beauty and the fascination in it, and you become more and more drawn to it.
I totally, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. And it is funny because this is a book that I couldn't have written, like, just, I mean, not just sort of as a writer, as a historian, but psychologically, I couldn't have written this book even 5 years ago. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
it's sort of what also runs through this book. So you see your sort of your psychological way is drawing out sort of other layers that
I love
yeah. Oh
it.
dear, this is like exposing the soft underbelly, isn't it? but yeah, but the other thing that very much so in the time between essentially signing the contract for this book and then delivering it, I had two babies in very quick succession, and
Oh,
COVID
wow.
happened.
Okay.
So they're 1 year apart, and the
Yeah.
second was born very much in the middle of sort of the winter of, oh gosh, lockdown 3, I think. And then there lots of sort of and it wasn't a good time psychologically, and there were sort of lots of, and actually I so for me, this is sort of a celebration of kind of humanity, but from the point of view of it's okay that some of this is dark. Let's sort of, as you say, let's sort of turn towards the darkness, and sort of, it actually ended up being written down very, very early on in the book, and then I realized, oh, this is what I want to go out with. And it said, it's through those little fragments of lives, the bits and pieces that fell between the cracks, that we're able to reach out through time and space. And then, we listen to the brief flashes of their stories, like blurred radio signals that cut out and pick up interference from other stations. And among the white noise, the vanished moments sucked into time are lives lived, events experienced, and emotions felt. And it's that last line, I say, and so we bear witness to those who came before us, gather them into our own stories, give them new meanings and new voices. And that for me was quite a difficult passage to write.
It reminds me, there's a psychiatrist who is quite influential in my work named Irvin Yalom, and I say was, he's still alive, but he's no longer practicing. But he's quite close to the end, and he talks about, he writes quite a lot about fear of death and about why we struggle with our own mortality and what kinds of things come up for us when we contemplate mortality. And one of the things he speaks about is, that he finds as a great comfort, is this idea of ripples, that even if we are not famous, even if we are not some great leader and we don't have books and books and books written about us, we impact others in these small ways. We send ripples out into the water of existence, and they continue to ripple and they continue to impact others. And really, I feel like you're tapping into this idea that all of these were people, and their ripples continue to shape the, the writing of
Yeah,
history. They affect
I
us.
think that's that is, yeah, as close to what I was trying to do, I think, and I could never express it so eloquently, but that's exactly it. It's, yeah, and there are so many different versions of any historical period that you can tell, but for me, yeah, it was essentially, it was about the ripples, and it was bearing witness. And it, exactly as you say, it's not, it's ironic in a way, because there's the very famous Old Norse poem, written down in the sort of the 13th century, but sort of we're not sure how old it is, and it's called Hauvamal, which is sayings of the High One, and the High One being Odin, the god, and so it's sort of a poem of his wisdom. And I say wisdom. Odin is not a very nice character, but let's leave that for now. But the most famous verse, it basically says, cattle die, kinsmen die, the self too must die. And the one thing that remains is sort of essentially the reputation of a good person. And it is that. And it's sort of, sometimes that's interpreted sort of very reasonably as sort of the fame of a good person. But when I read that, for me, my interpretation of that is much more about, yeah, the ripples, essentially. I feel that's, and it's actually, I mean, the title of the book also kind of feeds into that, because Embers of the Hands is a kenning. So it's a poetic, little sort of cryptic crossword clue, essentially, that, in Old Norse poetry. And these little, so Old Norse poetry is absolutely fiendish, particularly the type that uses kennings. I mean, it's, oh my goodness, called skaldic verse, and it's written down by sort of these often quite famous skalds who, would be working at royal courts and all the rest of it. And so it's very intricate, very beautiful, but very sort of gnarly poetry. And so you might get, I'm trying to think, there's some really great kennings, but it's essentially poetic ways of describing a very ordinary thing. And Embers of the Hands means gold or treasure. And it's, you imagine sort of glowing, something glowing in your hand. And
something that's quite dangerous to hold on to.
Yeah,
like it's hot. And
exactly.
if you're not careful, it'll burn a hole in your hand.
Exactly. There's a potency to, yeah. And initially, it's part of a poem that's written about King Harold Hardrada, who we've already mentioned, killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England in 1066, because Harold had sort of a very kind of like, when we think of those stereotypical Vikings that, we opened with, Harold is basically that in many ways. He's a kind of daring do adventurer who goes off to Constantinople, now Istanbul, and he sort of becomes one of the members of the bodyguard of the Emperor of Byzantium, and he all sorts of adventures, comes back, eventually becomes King of Norway. And this poem is written about something he does in Constantinople when he's there. It's not a very nice thing that he does. He sort of blinds someone on the orders of the emperor. But he gains embers of the hands. He gains treasure. He gains gold as a result of what he's done. And that's all good. But again, I thought, yeah, those aren't my embers of the hands, because the embers of the hands I'm talking about are sort of forget the headline hitters, forget sort of the kings and, the sort of saga heroes and the people who would end up in sort of the historical chronicles and annals. The embers of the hands for me are those little glowing remnants of lives lived, and very much ordinary everyday lives lived. Because I mean, it's sort of, if you have I don't know, they always say, if you've got to get out your house really quickly and you're not going to be able to come back, what are you going to take? Well, it's very rare people are going to take, it's sort of topical at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like I was thinking, I'm thinking about my go bag that I packed this week here in LA. And I've had this conversation with patients and with colleagues. And what's so funny is I also think you have different kinds of people. And I don't know this, I'm about to get deep here, but, one of my favorite poems is this E.E. Cummings poem, Since Feeling is First, who pays any attention to the syntax of things will never wholly kiss you. And because it's a reminder for me to sort of get out of my cognitive self and get into my feeling self. And I packed my go bag and there was not a single sentimental thing in it. It was my passport, my mortgage
That's
documents,
so
some clothes,
interesting.
yeah. And
Yes.
I was like, okay, wow, my pictures would have burned,
Yes.
and I
Yeah.
don't have that many sentimental things,
Yeah.
but I didn't really even think in that moment
That
to
is
save
so
those
interesting.
things.
And the thing is, I'm sort of very lucky not to have had to pack such a bag at this point. But and it's really interesting. It's because the things that spring to mind that I would pack. I mean, to be honest, I'm I'm so impractical. I probably would pack this bag and then be completely screwed. It'd be like
Because you have you don't have a
no,
toothbrush.
exactly. Oh my goodness, I would. Yeah, my bag would basically be the equivalent of what my children would pack. It would be sort of the cuddly toy I've had from birth, and like my favorite books.
But see, that's so lovely because all those other things that I'm packing for practicality can be replaced. But the things that you're packing will never be
I
replaced.
don't know, because
if they burn in the fire,
yeah,
they're gone.
But I get halfway down the street, realize I can't go back, and I'll be like, oh shit,
Right.
I've not got a toothbrush, I've not got my passport, I've not got my car keys. So,
Yep.
So I think
So my life might be easier post fire, but yours may be richer, and I think that's the difference there.
Well, I'm not going to be able to start my car with my childhood teddy bear, am I? So,
exactly.
Yeah, but it is that, isn't it? And it is interesting. It's yeah. I think that writing this book really made me think about that. It was like, what do you value? And the other place that happens, of course, is graves, and that's like a huge source of because in the Viking Age, as in many other cultures, before they sort of convert to Christianity, which is around the year 1000, give or take, they're often buried with grave goods. And again, it's not what's in your grab bag when you're trying to make sure you can get out of the house safely, but it's sort of a version of that, because it's what are you going to take to the next world with you? The UK cover is different to the US cover. And on the UK cover...
Yeah, on the US cover, there's a comb and
and a Thor's hammer.
I don't know what the thing is. It looks like...
Yeah.
Yeah, a hammer.
Yeah, I mean, literally, it's hilarious, that Thor. So you see there's runes, those little spiky letters on top. They literally read, if you translate it, this is a hammer. Like, thanks.
And I'm like, what is this?
Exactly.
Yeah. It's like a hand hammer.
Yes,
like
it's sort of about... It's actually about belief. So it's about the symbol of the pagan god Thor. He's like the thunderer, so it's that. And the comb on the other side is the earliest example of, you see it's got runes on it as well. It's the earliest example of runes that we can read. They date, way back. You think we were placing the Viking Age. These runes that on the comb, they were found in a Danish bog. They were deposited there with a load of other war gear. So this is clearly a very turbulent time. There's lots of Roman Empire stuff there, even though Denmark was never part of the Roman Empire. But we're talking around the year 160. So so if we're trying to work out the origins of the Viking Age, well, you can take it back into sort of the Roman Empire, essentially. But what's interesting is that, well, actually, neither of these examples, to my knowledge, I'm trying to think about the Thor's hammer, because plenty of them are found, but I can't remember the context in which this one was found. But a lot of the artifacts in the book were ones that were found in graves. And there's something, there's one, and it's on the UK version, and it's certainly inside as an image on the US version. There's a little sort of piece of metal, and it looks, and on it there's sort of a embossed, I think is it's either a lion or it's a wolf or something, and it's kind of pouncing. And that was found. It's a really interesting one, actually, because again, if we're talking about that, what is the Viking story? Even with those raids, which are very sort of masculine, there are women in those stories as well, because that specific artifact was found in the grave of a woman and a child. But the artifact itself was taken, it looks like, from a Christian, maybe a sort of the cover of a gospel book, which were they were very ornate, very highly decorated. So it was probably taken on a raid, and it was given to a woman, not necessarily the woman that was buried with it. It looks like it's been passed down the generations, and it was turned into a brooch. And so, in terms of those embers of the hands, even something that is quite shiny and quite bling in a way, actually they take on new meanings and new contexts depending on sort of what happens to their lives, the sort of the lives of these objects as they sort of travel down the centuries, and the lives of the people who come to own them. So it's always, it's so much, there's a kind of a warp and a weft to this sort of history that can pick up so many different threads.
And that's, I think, when you do have that moment. And I know that you almost cautioned us because the past is like another universe. But, when we look at this, I guess more like from a biologic, evolutionary, genetic perspective, even though it was a long time ago and maybe people were slightly more diminutive or maybe people were slightly more whatever, they're
Yeah,
people. We are the
yeah,
exact same species,
yes.
and as insofar as language shapes us and experience shapes us, fine, but the capacity is there. Like, it's the difference between lifespan and life expectancy. Like, the lifespan has never changed for people. The life expectancy has changed based on external factors, but genetically, there's nothing in us that said we had to die young back in the day. We just got diseases and didn't have medicine. So when I think about, a person on a Viking ship, that could be me if I were dropped into, I didn't choose when to be thrown into existence. They're not different from a people perspective. And that's the amazing thing. They're shaped differently.
There's just bits that really sort of get you sort of in the where
Mm-hmm.
and it is, and it's like, okay, I'm not saying I completely understand the nature of what this life would have been like, but I I kind of, I see you as another human who just lived. So one of those, in fact, sort of, if you've got the books, there's a I think they put
Mm-hmm.
the picture. So the end of chapter 3. So there's, and I think it's in the plates as well. But again, because so my US version, I have, they're all like being cozy inside rather than freezing cold in the potting shed right now. But so if you see right at the end of chapter 3,
Yep.
so there's these little sketches. And these little sketches that were drawn by a child in
I
a
see
classroom,
them.
you see. And what I
Yeah.
love is the one on the left. And of course, we can't know exactly what they were. It's the two figures, both dressed as warriors. And, they've both got these really cute garden
Yeah.
rake style. And, but one of them's clearly a child, one of them's a grown up. And for me, it's like, this has got to be his dad or his uncle or his brother or some,
Oh
do
yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
he's like, I'm a little mini me warrior. And then the one that's in the plates is, so sort of, I don't know if you've got the plates in the middle with all,
So sweet. I do.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm skipping to
And
them
he's just, and
here.
I think it's number 6, and it's one of these little, they're drawn on birch bark, and it's this little person again, and he's called Onfim. And I love this because this for me, yeah, feels like that moment of reaching out. You can see Onfim, and he's got his little eyebrow, and he's reaching out his little garden rake hand to another bigger figure who's sort of been cut off the edge. We don't have that. And for me, that image, that feels like the whole book. And I, it's interesting because there's a space between those two hands. They're not holding, and there is that space. There's that grey area, but yet
That reaching out. Yeah.
exactly. And
That yearning almost, or I
yeah,
don't.
and you
Yeah.
see
There's
the little
something
expression on
like
his
oh
face. Yeah,
yeah. And it's amazing too that even just the way that they're drawn is the way any child would
yeah,
draw a person.
exactly.
You know,
Yeah,
there's nothing, quote, foreign
no,
about it. There's not,
no,
it's that common
yeah,
humanity. It's got a face and it's
yeah,
got these like very stick-like arms and legs
yeah.
with the little fingers
Oh,
coming
it's just
off.
so
Oh,
sweet, isn't it? Yeah, and that there's so
yeah.
many of those, and sometimes you just get. So my parents have this tiny little like it's sort of a piece of fabric, it's a piece of embroidery that's in a frame, and the frame's all cracked. I think my mum picked it up in a charity shop, and it just says, it's embroidered, and it says "Remember me," and then underneath it has a date, and it's 1851, and for me, I've always, again, that's something that sometimes is quite hard to look at because it's so poignant,
Yeah, it makes me yeah, I'm like very
Yeah,
emotional even thinking about like
yeah,
I'm creating it in my mind obviously
yes,
because I've never
yeah,
seen it, but what a
it,
beautiful I mean
yeah,
because of course I work with individuals who are approaching end of life and we have conversations like who do I give at what to, and what matters to
Yes.
me in the end,
Yes.
and what do I want people to
Yeah.
remember about me? What is my legacy?
That's
And
it, isn't it?
we
Yeah.
even in my clinic, we have once a month or once every few months actually, uh, a meeting with all of the different providers and clinicians, and we go through and we read the names of everyone we've lost during that period, and people will speak up and they'll say these lovely things like, I worked with, so and so for this many years, and I remember she always wore this one, woolen hat. And one time I commented on it and she told me how she knitted it before her first chemo. And, and there's always these stories that are told, and it's like an iconography of a people.
Yes. That's
These
it.
things stick out for
That
us,
yes.
and we
Yeah.
remember them.
That's it. And I mean, I know even sort of within kind of our little family unit, there's one of their uncle's birthdays, and every year we celebrate, even though he's no longer here, but it's with daffodils, because that was when it was his birthday, there were always daffodils. Or there are people who, quite a few family members, who are essentially sort of knitted into the stories of the family, even when sort of so in the case of my children, they've never actually met these people. They died before
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they are still, and they'll say things like, oh, I don't know, I love Granny Gree. And for me, that's my Dutch grandma, who sort of was unbelievably influential in my, and I know it's part of their story, it's part of their narrative, even though it's part of their family memory, their cultural memory, their sense of who they are. And that's something that, in a way, yeah, it just felt like a slightly longer, chronologically speaking, like a
Yes.
version of that. It's like
Yes.
you are part, is what I say in that last paragraph. We knit them into our stories. We create new, you're seen and you're remembered.
Yes.
And in
And whether they knew it or
yes.
not, like
Yeah.
they may not have ever thought about the fact that putting this thing in the grave with,
Yes.
this could have been for some very personal
Yeah.
reason,
Yeah.
or maybe there were times where it was like, I will carve this into a wall for future
Yes.
people to
And there's
see,
definitely a bit of that too.
but
Yes.
yeah, but either way, those things, those little fleeting
Mm.
nuggets, those embers of the hands,
Mm.
yeah, they persist, and they help us piece together maybe not a perfect story, and maybe a story that we take liberties with, but an animation of the past, because that, I think, is that is the fundamental truth, is that these were people, and we are of the same lineage. We are these
Yeah.
people as well.
Exactly that.
Ugh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ugh. Eleanor, this was such a fascinating talk. There's a million things in the book we didn't even touch on, but I never feel too guilty about that, because I also feel like sometimes when you listen to a podcast episode and they're like, let me tell you everything in the book, and people go,
Yes.
oh, okay, it's like I read the book.
Exactly.
I don't need to buy it now.
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
no. Yeah, yeah. Still read the book. There's a lot there. But I like to kind of whet my appetite for a book by talking about these themes a little bit more.
Yeah.
And also, first thing in the morning, right? You're in the UK, I'm here in the US, so we're recording this first thing my morning.
Yes. Yeah.
Notice when I said to you on the recording that was the first time I'd used my voice today.
Yes. See, whereas I'm done. This is I'm sort of what, it's just gone 6 my time, so clocking off for the weekend soon.
But perfection. But yes, this kind of shared humanity, whether it's across distance or across time, I think is something that is so deeply meaningful, and that we don't always, I mean, you do, I think to some extent I do, but we as a people don't always take the time to really revel in and sit with the reality of how much awe there is in the fact that we can connect across oceans and also across millennia.
Yeah.
Like, that's incredible.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I really love it that at the beginning you said, I'm just not that into Vikings, but honestly,
Yeah.
I feel I'm trying to think of a sort of not cliched way of saying this. I can't really think it's because it's past 6, right, my side, but like I feel so seen. I feel like you see what I was trying to do. So thank you so much. It like, seriously, it's so uplifting. It's like, yeah,
Oh, I
thank
love
you.
that. And thank you for for speaking to somebody like me. You know what I mean? Like I
Such a
think
pleasure.
you feel seen because there is something to see there. Like there definitely is there's a world that we live in. And, I talk about this a lot on the show and whatever. We won't get into it the last few minutes, but we live in a very intensely patriarchal, male white supremacist world. And it's the water we swim in, so we don't always see it. It's so normative and it's so in the background for most people that we think it's essentialist, and it's the way it is. But the truth of the matter is, as women, very often we're confronted with our second class nature. And I think to hear these grapplings from somebody who gets it, it's like that's why I see you, because you see me. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, seriously, we won't, don't worry, but we could spend a whole hour just do a
Exactly,
second
we could,
podcast.
but we won't. We
Oh
could.
my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole bit, one of my favorite bits,
You're
not
right.
to sort of go off on a tangent, no, it was not. But there is one of my favorite bits of the whole book is basically when I'm describing women's textile production, which sounds like it should be, like, let's not kid ourselves, a little bit tedious. But what I try and say is, look, without these women, there wouldn't be any Viking Age, because there'd be no sails to get across. If they're making textiles, there'd be no clothes. You just end up with some naked men in a rowing boat. And then, because they're the ones that are also sort of giving birth a lot of the time, or bringing up the children, whatever it is, well, before long, you've just got a boat because there's no one left. So,
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean,
one guy in a boat with a bunch of gold, nothing to do with it.
You enjoy that, mate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, yes. There are many, many layers to that. You're right. We could go for another hour on that. But I will not keep you. But I am just so very, very grateful for the hour that you spent with us today, for the book. Everybody, it is called Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age by Dr. Eleanor Barraclough. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Honestly, it's a complete pleasure. Thank you.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.